Oh my God. Somebody fire this umpire, please. College football nerds, we are finally talking Big Ten football. And in this one, we're talking Michigan and Minnesota. We are super excited that you guys are on board. It was a little shaky there for a little while, but we're excited to talk Big Ten football. Josh is with me. We're going to get nerdy with you, but just a little caveat here. This season has been wild already, but we at least know some stuff about the teams that have played. We've missed spring practice. We haven't seen a lot from fall camps for these Big Ten teams. So like we were in week 1 for the SEC, Big 12, ACC, we are there for the Big Ten right now where we don't know what we don't know. So bear with us if we miss a player who's somewhere on the depth chart that we don't know, or a transfer or an opt-out. Give us some slack. In a couple of weeks, we'll know a whole lot more about these teams, and we'll sound a little more educated about what we're talking about. All right, Josh, for those that haven't been watching, and this is just now they're really kind of getting into the swing of things because their league hasn't been playing, what we've seen this year has been really just a lot of crazy and a lot of chaos and a lot of teams losing to teams they shouldn't. So one of the pieces of that has really been that the offenses are way ahead of the defenses, even good defenses. They're way ahead of the defenses because they miss contact in practice or they miss spring practice or any of that. I want you to frame this discussion of Minnesota and Michigan around that reality. And does it mean that, like, look, we got a returning incumbent, really good quarterback in Tanner Morgan coming back on one side, and we got a new starter on another? That's it. That's a wrap. Or is there more to it? Obviously, there's more to it, or I wouldn't ask you.
One of the things we noticed in the early weeks for teams is that continuity matters more than normal. Teams that had a lot of returning offensive linemen were a lot better offensively. Teams that had a lot of returning secondary players were better. And I will say, Bill Connolly's often made the point that the greatest indicator of success is continuity in the secondary. People point to the offensive line a lot. It's still important, but it's actually somewhat average. It matters a lot because there's 5 of them on the offensive line. It's not necessarily more important than other positions. There is a significant thing with the secondary. I think playing corner or safety at the Division I level, you have to get used to the speed. You have to understand coverages. It's very different than playing high school. If you make a bust in the secondary, you get exposed and you give up a touchdown. You can't hide flaws, and you really can't play that position well until you've gotten experience playing the ball in the air and, dealing with the sort of athletes you play on a regular basis. This is an interesting game in that those two positions are in very different situations for the respective teams. Michigan returns most of their defense, and the guys that are quote-unquote new, guys like Daxton Hill, they played a lot of snaps, right? And they were effectively starters last year, even though, you lose a guy like Josh Metellus. I think on Michigan's side of the ball, it's interesting because they lost 10 draft picks, but of those 10, 7 of the 10 were 5th round or later, meaning that there's a lot of players, but they were, kind of borderline NFL guys. And the majority of them being like 6th round picks are not, don't normally expect those guys to make the roster more often than not. So a lot of solid, well-developed players NFL teams are going to give a shot to, not a ton of high-level NFL talent, to be completely blunt, and that is a good thing this year. But what they did lose in that was more or less the entire offensive line. I mean, they returned the right tackle, Jalen Mayfield, but you lose the other 4. You lost an awesome center in Ruiz. That's going to be a problem for Michigan early in this season. I mean, we saw with Georgia in the opener against Arkansas, their offensive line was terrible. They couldn't run the ball in Arkansas. They were going backwards on offense almost the whole first half of that game. They kind of gelled, did better in the second half, but they had a huge talent advantage. And then a few weeks later, they're just blowing people off the ball. And now they look like one of the better offensive lines in the country because they're ultra talented. But it's pretty clear in that first game the lack of continuity mattered. The flip side of that is defensively, Minnesota is in rebuilding mode. And I just talked about continuity on defense and in the back 7 is highly important. Now, I think it helps for Minnesota that you get both the corners back, because corners, are kind of maybe the most important part of this puzzle. But what we've seen like early on with Alabama, they had turnover at safety. And the safety play was atrocious for them. It gave up a ton of points in the Ole Miss game where guys are busting assignments, missing tackles. And in the current world of hurry up, no huddle and RPO, it puts a lot more strain on safeties than it used to. Because it used to be you read run pass based off how the lineman blocked. And if they go downfield, it's a run play and you crash and fill an alley. If they stay down, it's a pass play, you drop in coverage. The RPO and the 3-yard rule has broken that. It's made it a lot more difficult to be a safety. And, both these teams run a lot of modern concepts or maybe not as modern as most, but I say as most, not as modern as some have gone to, but there's still a lot of RPO concepts and they're both trying to continually implement more of that. So I think that's sort of the framework of the game. On Michigan's side, you've got a lot of lack of continuity in the offensive line, ton of continuity on defense. On Minnesota's side, I'll add total continuity on the offensive line, which is a huge advantage early in the season, but a lot of turnover in defense. So you kind of have a strength on weakness on both sides. And it's going to be interesting. And I think it's going to, as I talk about a lot, it's going to increase the variability of this game. The number of mistakes that may occur from Minnesota's defense and give up cheap points is going to be significant. And the number of mistakes that, Michigan's offensive line may generate is going to be significant. So that Minnesota defense on Michigan offense matchup is exceptionally hard to predict in week 1.
In this sort of weird COVID game, just in your opinion, do you see this as potentially being higher scoring because of all of the things that you just said, being higher scoring, and maybe that wouldn't be the case in, say, Game 7 versus Game 1?
I definitely think that's true. And we also did an Ohio State Nebraska preview where we kind of pointed out the same thing, that even the high-level defenses, for the most part, have had their glitches really early in the season. Like Georgia pretty much shut down Arkansas, but they gave up a couple huge plays, and they gave up a touchdown on a broken play. And we've seen that kind of across the board with even teams traditionally very good, like Auburn, are not very good this year defensively. I think in week 1, you should expect more points. Even, Michigan, they're a really well-coached team. They're really sound. They've got a lot of continuity, but I would expect more mistakes. I will say this, though, is an interesting angle. I think Michigan is more well-positioned than most teams. You're still going to have issues with tackling and angles. They haven't been allowed to do as much contact in practice. And I don't know the exact particulars of the Big Ten rules, but I understand them to be maybe a bit more strict in that regard for stuff they've been able to do, which is going to show up. But Don Brown's defense, as much as like on this channel we said for years and years, and I think people have kind of warmed up to it, it has a lot of issues when you play really high power offenses or offenses that have a lot of verticality because it's too predictable and it relies too much on concepts that can be exploited. But this year, that's the best thing ever. Arkansas is not a talented defense, and they're probably the best defense outside Georgia in the SEC right now. The reason for that is they have Barry Odom running a really pretty simple zone-based defense for the most part, and they're just trying to be assignment sound and not do anything fancy. And Brown, with his schemes, he likes to bring pressure and all this, but it's actually pretty straightforward on what the assignments are. And while it can get guys isolated, they generally know what they're supposed to be doing, which a lot of teams don't right now. And I think due to the continuity and that scheme, I actually think Michigan is going to be in a better position defensively than a lot of teams are at this point in the season. But again, it's interesting because on the flip side, I think you're going to see a lot of discoordination or however you want to put it with Minnesota, with as much turnover they have and having it's kind of remains to be seen how good the defense will or will not be. But I think especially on Minnesota's side of the ball, you're going to see a lot of glitches. And even on Michigan's side of the ball, you're definitely going to see that it's week 1. And the offenses have absolutely been ahead of the defenses to this point in almost every conference.
And Minnesota fans right about now are going to say, you're saying a lot of good stuff about Michigan, which makes me feel you're going to pick Michigan. And they're going to remind us that we picked against them both in the Penn State game and in the Auburn game, and we got them wrong, and they're going to want some acknowledgement. So acknowledgement, we were wrong. It happens. One of the things we've seen over a number of years is teams that aren't normally great can artificially build up experience where if they were really good, they'd have a lot of guys leaving early, and instead they're really talented guys who are having to stay their junior or senior season because their team isn't getting the kind of exposure that they would get normally, or if they're really good, and so their draft position wouldn't be as high commensurate with their talent. So we saw who Minnesota was last year, and we did say that Minnesota's offense was the kind of offense that was going to pressure and put strain on Penn State's defense, and they did the same thing to Auburn to maybe a lesser extent. Are there any concerns for you about Minnesota that they were that team last year that didn't have a ton of recruiting talent, but over the years coached up and had a lot of guys stay in the system to where they were that seasoned 2017 Georgia that kind of had their shot last year and then might have a lot of drop off this year, and we're overhyping them coming into the season? Do you see that as a possibility?
I really think we're going to see Minnesota show up and be the team we expected them to be, honestly. I mean, we had them, we had them pegged in some ways wrong last year. It's kind of funny because the games we picked them to lose, and the games they lost, I probably would have picked them to win. But Minnesota last season benefited, I think, I'm just being honest, they benefited from their schedule in that they played Penn State, but they managed to dodge Ohio State, and they managed to dodge Michigan. They played three teams that I would have said were a real threat in Penn State, Wisconsin, and Iowa. They went 1-2 in those games in the regular season. That's why we were skeptical in the Auburn game. I will say there were some other things we misevaluated in that Auburn game. Particularly, we made too much of the fact that Auburn moved the ball against Alabama when I think Alabama's defense was just broken at that point due to injury. That's a different discussion. But I do think Minnesota was a really good team. Their offense got slowed down late. There were various reasons for that. I think the continuity they have means they're going to take another step forward this year. And, Rashad Bateman opted out but came back in. He got cleared to play. That's huge. They've got one of the better quarterbacks coming back. Again, they've got a ton of offensive line continuity, which most teams won't have. I think all around, Minnesota's in an excellent position to be successful. What I will say is you talked about them being, maybe being a team that benefited from seniority. I would say that's probably going to be to some extent this year. I think this is the year for Minnesota. Looking at the number of junior, senior players, especially the offensive side of the ball, but defense as well, even with guys that are slated to be in the new starting depth chart. There's a lot of seniority on this team. They're probably going to lose a lot of guys to the draft next year. I don't think you're going to return Rashad Bateman. I don't know that you're going to return Tanner Morgan. And this is their year to shine. So I would say that I don't think they're going to fall off or that last year was a fluke. I think last year the record may have been about a year ahead of where they really were. This year, though, is the real year for them and the year to produce. And as I said, to a certain extent, they're kind of returning at the right positions offensively to be very successful in a tough year and to put up points early on teams that defensively are still figuring things out. And we'll talk about it later, but the schedule is also a benefit to that. But I think the truth of the matter is Michigan definitely going to have their hands full with a great Minnesota offense in week one, in a week where all the defenses are kind of discombobulated.
And I want to get into that schedule discussion, so I'm going to go ahead and give my picks now because I think right now the picks are a guess because we don't know what's going on. We don't know what to expect. So we're kind of flying blind there, but we do know what the schedules are going to look like for the rest of the year. So I think that's an interesting discussion. Right now, given what we've seen with COVID crazy so far, I'm going with seniority and experience at quarterback. Especially since they run the type of offense that will strain even a good defense if they haven't really got their act together. So I'm going to go with Minnesota. I do think it's a little higher scoring, And I think this will be a weird game. Both these fan bases need to prepare themselves for a lot of miscues, a lot of weirdness, though there is some benefit of starting late, that maybe you get through all that. Maybe you have enough practice and touch points that you're a little more comfortable than we saw the Big 12 in that opening weekend. Give me 37-31 Minnesota, and that has them covering. Tell me what you got.
You talk about the advantages. I'm going to go with seniority on defense. I think in the early games, the teams that have veteran defenses have been in an advantage. It's a guess, but I'm going to say Michigan. I'm going to say 34-31. I mean, picking a score at this point, not knowing what the offenses are going to look like or the defenses feels almost silly, but that is where it is. And if you're a Minnesota fan, please don't hate me. I feel like this is a total guess. I mean, the line is, last I saw, 2.5 points in Minnesota's favor. I think that's probably fair. I'm just guessing that Minnesota's defense maybe makes one or two busts to let Michigan win the game in week 1 in a way they wouldn't later. It will 0% shock me if Minnesota wins this game. It'll 0% shock me if either team wins in a blowout. I really don't know what to expect. One thing I want to talk about before we get in the schedule discussion, though, is we did a Michigan preview 3 months ago, which was the same as 3 years ago for all intents and purposes. One of the things we talked about in that preview was our concern whether Michigan was going to rely on the sort of known quantity in Dylan McCaffrey, or whether they were going to make a move at quarterback and try to be, maybe something better, quote unquote. And that we didn't feel like Michigan was ever going to get over the hump with what they had in McCaffrey from what we'd seen. Yeah, he was enough to beat the regular teams on the schedule, but just the lack of arm talent, the fact that he wasn't he was a good athlete in terms of he could run, but he's not a natural runner, if you understand the distinction. A lot of guys at quarterback are mobile, but they're not really runners. And that's what McCaffrey was, even though they tried to run him a lot. Didn't take hits, didn't run through contact that great. I give Michigan credit for going with Milton, and they're trying to hit a higher ceiling. I don't know how much confidence I do or don't have in Gaddis. We had none going into last year. I think that was proven right early in the season. They kind of changed up what they had planned to institute, made something better. I'm gambling that they figured some of that out, basically, because I do think Minnesota is going to put up points in this game. I just think week 1, Minnesota's defense isn't going to be where they're going to be at the end of the season. I think if they played later in the year, I would pick Minnesota. But week 1, I think the defensive consistency in Brown's scheme and how long they've spent learning that system is going to be an advantage that I think gives Michigan just a little bit of an edge.
Yeah, like you, nothing's going to surprise me in this game. The only thing that will surprise me in this game is if both teams are playing like they've got their act completely together. That would be somewhat shocking. Okay, so on this schedule discussion, I think it's an important one because one of the things we talked about in the Michigan preview was Michigan's not going to be a bad team this year, but their schedule is not going to afford them the opportunity to show how good they are because it's just brutal. COVID helped them a little bit there because they got a little bit of a reprieve, but it's still not an easy schedule. Minnesota fans, don't get mad when we say you have an easy schedule because, look, we say this all the time. 2018 Clemson. You can be the best team in the country and have a just trash schedule, and you don't have that. But what we're saying is it's more about how you play, not who you play. You can't help if someone's great on your schedule or someone's bad on your schedule. You just need to handle business. So if Minnesota wins this game, Josh, let's talk about it because really I don't think Iowa's going to be great this year. They avoid Penn State and Ohio State. Really, it's just that Wisconsin game and whatever Wisconsin.
I think the notable thing here is, like you said, Michigan got something of a reprieve. Like, you're not opening the season with Washington, but you still got a really ridiculously rough schedule. Most Big Ten teams are playing 1 to 2 ranked teams. Most played about 2. And we were talking about with like Ohio State. I almost think it's a bad thing they don't play more because they're trying to make the national title. I think if they dominate their schedule, they're in good shape, but they can't really afford a loss given the number of ranked teams they're probably going to play this year. Michigan has the kind of schedule Ohio State wanted. You got 4 ranked teams. You play Minnesota, you play Wisconsin, you play Penn State, you play Ohio State. You're playing all the big boys in the Big Ten, at least on paper going into the season. If Michigan loses this game to Minnesota, let's just be realistic. I mean, I don't. It's fair to say you're probably not going to beat Ohio State. Just looking historically, maybe I'm wrong, but on paper, you're probably not going to beat Ohio State. And then let's say you split Penn State and Wisconsin, you're already looking at a 5-3 record. Um, Only, and I don't think anybody's going to be particularly happy with it. Now, I will say, your off games, Michigan State has not been very good. Indiana, Rutgers, Maryland, it's all or nothing in the schedule. Not any mid tier teams, really really hard ones or really bad ones. So 4-4 record for Michigan is absolutely on the table this season. Even if they could be the 15th best team in the country and finish 4-4, given how difficult their schedule is. On the flip side, with Minnesota, they could be the 10th or 15th best team in the country and go undefeated to the Big Ten championship game. If Minnesota beats Michigan, you're pretty much penciling them in at, 7-1 or 8-0, because you're going to beat Maryland. You're going to beat Northwestern. You're probably going to beat Nebraska. You're probably going to beat Illinois. Iowa could be a tough game. Purdue could be a tough game. Both those teams have been deficient on one side of the ball to such an extent that a balanced team generally beats them. A good balanced team has generally beaten them. I know Minnesota lost to Iowa last season 19-23, but I think they would turn it around this year. I would think they're going to be favored in that game. So it just kind of comes down to Wisconsin. And at worst, I'm kind of thinking you split one between Iowa, Wisconsin, or you go probably 2-1 between Iowa, Purdue, and Wisconsin, maybe. I mean, I don't know. I don't know where the loss even really comes from. So if Minnesota beats Michigan and they end up at 7-1, given that like Penn State and Ohio State play each other and Michigan, it's going to be hard for those teams not to have a loss somewhere along the way. Now there's the tiebreaker danger with Wisconsin, but Minnesota's in a really good path to make the Big Ten championship game. And like you said, don't take it, as Daniel said, don't take it as a slight, but Minnesota can almost sort of make the Big Ten championship by default. A lot like, to me, it reminds me a lot of like Missouri in the Big 12 days when they were there and their division was really weak. Missouri was a good team. They weren't always a team that really was on Oklahoma and Texas's level when Oklahoma and Texas were top 10 level teams in that period, but they were always in the conference championship game because the road was so much easier. The good thing if you're Minnesota is you can just kind of build on this schedule. You've got teams that are good enough to push you, but that you should be able to beat, and you can hopefully improve. And if you get that one shot in the Big Ten championship game against somebody like an Ohio State, there are many, many times a team in that position that gets their one shot punches the ticket, because you know what you're able to play for. And if you come out of that Wisconsin game and you win that game and you got Northwestern and Nebraska on deck, I won't say you look ahead, but you kind of start looking ahead. And if you know you're going to play Ohio State, you start putting some extra resources and some extra practice and start throwing in some concepts are going to come from Ohio State, because you got a one-game shot to make the playoffs at that point. Minnesota has one of the more advantageous schedules in the country, and as we said, Michigan could be a touchdown worse than Minnesota, and Michigan could finish 4-4, and Minnesota could finish 7-1, and that's just the difference in the schedules this season.
All right, and just one more thing to sew up this discussion. Let's say your pick is right, and Michigan wins this game, which would be a huge win under their belt. What do you think their ceiling is for this season if they come out with a win?
I will say if they were to come out with a win, probably 8-2. I don't see them winning more than one of three against Wisconsin, Penn State, and Ohio State, unless Joe Milton really shocks me. And he's a junior, and it's telling to me that he's been around that long and he wasn't a better option, that he wasn't being worked into given that the quarterbacks haven't been fantastic to this point. So I can't see the offense being just absolute gangbusters. And you got good teams in the league. Maybe 9-1 if you win the Minnesota game, but I think realistically I almost think your ceiling is 2-2 with the 4 ranked games you've got. Am I being overly harsh with that?
No, I think that's fair. I think that's fair, and I think the ceiling is probably where they are. Like, I don't think their floor is too much lower, and I don't think their ceiling is too much higher.
Yeah, that's about all. I mean, that's about all I got in this game. I think hopefully this discussion's been entertaining enough. Again, I like to watch spring practice for these early games. I like to watch the first couple weeks of the season. We're going to be much better in 2 to 3 weeks when we can actually watch football, because that's what I do to get prepared for these games, not just relying on statistics, but I like to actually watch the teams, and I wasn't able to do that. We will be watching these teams throughout the season. And then for Daniel's part, I mean, his discussion's going to be a lot better when he's not sitting on pins and needles watching his Braves over the back of his camera while we're having this discussion. But it'll be a fun one to watch, and I think this is certainly one of the more interesting games, if not the most interesting game to me this week.
Yeah, we're recording this while Game 7's going on, and I am on absolute pins and needles. Through the power of editing, we've cut out some bad language and some frustrating moments for me. Yeah, our show will get a lot better when there's no more baseball for me to worry about. All right, y'all, that's it for us. Thanks so much. Have a great week, and God bless.